Let us consider for a moment the immense fear that surrounds the act of letting go. Why is it so difficult? Why does it feel like a small death each time we release a person, a place, a pattern, or even a cherished belief? It is because the ego, this fragile construct that calls itself I, believes its survival depends upon holding on. It clings, not out of love, but out of terror. It fears the unknown more than it fears suffering. And so we bind ourselves to what is decaying, mistaking familiarity for truth. The ego, in psychological terms, is the center of our conscious identity. It is the I that speaks, acts, remembers, and desires. It gives us coherence in the outer world and allows us to function with a sense of continuity and control. However, it is not the totality of who we are. The ego is merely a fragment, a limited construct that emerges from the vast and largely unconscious background of the psyche. It is shaped by personal experiences, cultural influences, family expectations, and inherited patterns. It is not our essence, but rather a mask shaped by necessity and survival. Yet we identify with it almost completely. We cling to the ego's image of ourselves, its roles, its preferences, its ambitions, its defenses, as though letting go of any of these would be equivalent to ceasing to exist. This clinging becomes particularly problematic when we encounter crisis, change, or the need for psychological transformation. The ego resists letting go because it perceives any form of surrender as death, and in a way, it is not wrong. A part of us must die in order for something deeper to emerge. This death, however, is symbolic. It is the death of the false self, the provisional self, the self that is rooted in fear, control, and illusion. Beneath the ego lies what depth psychology refers to as the self, a greater, more expansive center of the personality that includes both conscious and unconscious elements. The self is not merely an improved ego, it is a different organizing principle altogether. It encompasses the totality of the psyche and represents wholeness, integration, and authentic being. The process of individuation, the central aim of deep psychological work, involves a movement away from ego identification toward greater alignment with the self. But this movement is neither easy nor automatic. It requires the ego to surrender its illusion of centrality. It must recognize that it is not the master of the house, but a guest in a much vaster and more mysterious structure. This recognition does not come through intellectual insight alone. It often comes through suffering, through breakdowns, through the failure of the ego to maintain its grip on reality. It is in these moments when control slips, when identities collapse, when attachments are ripped away, that the possibility of transformation is born. Letting go in this context is not a passive act. It is not simply forgetting or abandoning. It is an active surrender. It is the willingness to step into uncertainty, to release the known self, to trust that what lies beyond the ego's horizon is not annihilation, but truth. The ego, naturally, resists this. It wants guarantees. It wants to see the next step. But the journey toward the self does not offer such comforts. It asks for faith in the unknown, for a descent into the underworld of the psyche, where new forms are being gestated in darkness. This surrender is not a one-time event. It is a continual process. Over and over, we are asked to let go of identities that no longer serve us, of attachments that keep us small, of patterns that prevent our growth. And each time we do, the ego fears it is losing something essential. But what it is losing is not essential. What it is losing is control, illusion, limitation. What is essential remains, and in fact becomes more visible. The self does not emerge through willpower or effort. It emerges when space is made for it. When the ego steps aside, even slightly, the deeper layers of the psyche begin to communicate. Images arise from the unconscious. Symbols appear in dreams. Inner guidance begins to speak in a voice that is both ancient and intimate. The ego's task then is not to dominate, but to cooperate. It must learn humility not as self-deprecation, but as an accurate awareness of its place in the psychic order. The ego is not bad, it is necessary, but it is not sovereign. Its suffering comes from pretending to be what it is not, and its liberation comes from learning to relate to the self as a center beyond itself. This relationship is transformative. As the ego begins to align with the deeper truth of the self, a new identity begins to take shape. Not one based on image or adaptation, but one rooted in authenticity and wholeness. Letting go, therefore, is not the destruction of selfhood, but a precondition for discovering a deeper self. It is a kind of purification, a stripping away of the false so that the real may emerge. It is not a regression, but a maturation. In spiritual traditions, this is often described as a death and rebirth. In psychological terms, it is the dissolution of ego inflation and the awakening of symbolic awareness. What was once seen as catastrophe is reinterpreted as initiation. The pain of loss becomes the labor of new birth. This is not to romanticize suffering. The process of letting go can be deeply painful. It may involve grieving not only what was, but what could have been. It may bring us face to face with old wounds, repressed fears, and buried traumas. The descent into the unconscious is never easy, but it is in that descent that healing becomes possible. The self does not impose itself. It waits for readiness, and that readiness often comes when the ego has exhausted itself, when it can no longer pretend to be in control. At that threshold, something opens. The psyche becomes permeable. Symbols arise that speak not to the mind, but to the soul. And in their presence, a deeper understanding begins to dawn. The individual who lets go in this way does not become less of a person, but more. There is a quiet strength that arises from living in alignment with the self. There is clarity, depth, and resilience. The need to prove, to possess, to dominate begins to fall away. In its place comes a sense of inner authority, of groundedness, of purpose. This is not the product of striving, but of surrender, not of accumulation, but of release. To let go then is not to lose oneself, but to find a space in which the true self may emerge. In the course of psychological transformation, that inevitably arises a moment of collapse, a moment that feels like the world as one has known it is ending. This moment is not accidental, nor is it pathological in the deeper sense. It is the natural consequence of growth, when the structures that once upheld the personality have outlived their purpose. It is a death, though not in the literal sense. It is a death of form, of identity, of patterns and assumptions that have become too narrow to contain the emerging truth of the individual. This kind of death precedes rebirth. It is a passage, an initiation, a necessary dissolution before a new order can be born from the psyche. One cannot become something new without first ceasing to be what one was. Psychological death is not welcomed by the ego. The ego fears dissolution more than anything else, for it equates its continuity with life itself. To the ego, the unraveling of its constructs feels like annihilation. And yet, from a deeper perspective, this unraveling is the beginning of a far more authentic way of being. The ego cannot comprehend the totality of the self, and so it misinterprets transformation as destruction. But the psyche is not oriented toward destruction for its own sake. When it dismantles, it does so to make room for something greater. The collapse is not the end, it is the threshold. This threshold experience is found in myth, in religion, In the dreams of those undergoing deep inner work, it is the descent into the underworld, the dark night of the soul, the belly of the whale. It is a symbolic encounter with death, not just the death of others, but one's own symbolic death, the relinquishing of control, the surrender to forces beyond the personal will. This moment is marked by fear, confusion, and often despair. What once gave meaning no longer does. What once felt secure now feels fragile or irrelevant. The old maps no longer guide, and the soul stands naked before reality it cannot yet understand. And yet it is precisely in this moment that the seeds of rebirth are planted. The psyche, like nature, follows a rhythm of death and renewal. The acorn must fall apart for the oak to emerge. The caterpillar must dissolve inside the chrysalis for the butterfly to take shape. This pattern repeats itself in the human soul. The old identity must fragment so that a new wholeness can be realized. But this is not a linear process. It is cyclical, mysterious, and guided by forces that are not entirely under conscious control. The symbolic death may come through external events, loss of a loved one, the end of a relationship, a betrayal, an illness, a failure, or it may come from within, a deep sense of meaninglessness, a confrontation with one's own inner contradictions, a sudden awareness of the emptiness behind one's achievements. However it arrives, it demands the same response: surrender, not passive resignation, but the active willingness to let the old self die, to endure the chaos, to wait in the unknown. The ego, when it cannot escape, often tries to rebuild prematurely. It reaches for substitutes, distractions, compulsions, anything that might restore a sense of control. But the deeper wisdom of the psyche resists such shortcuts. It insists that the death be complete, that the old be truly relinquished. Only then can the new begin to gestate. The unconscious does not rush. It works in symbolic time, in the language of dreams, in images and moods and synchronicities that gradually lead the individual toward integration. This is not a return to innocence. Rebirth is not a regression to a former state of purity. It is a movement forward into a more differentiated and conscious state of being. The individual who has passed through death and emerged on the other side does not become someone entirely new, but someone more whole. Aspects of the personality that were once repressed or denied are now included. The shadow is no longer merely projected, it is recognized and integrated. The individual becomes more complex, more human, more capable of compassion, both for self and others. What is reborn is not the ego in its old form, but a deeper alignment between the ego and the self. The ego no longer imagines itself the ruler of the psyche, but becomes a servant to a greater inner authority. This alignment brings with it a sense of inner peace, not because life has become easier, but because one is no longer divided against oneself. The inner war has lessened. The masks have fallen away. The individual stands more fully in truth. Even when that truth is difficult, the process is painful and the pain must be honored. There is no spiritual bypassing here, no skipping over the grief and confusion. The soul's transformation demands that everything false be burned away. This fire is not literal but symbolic, a fire of feeling, of loss, of confrontation. It purifies, it clears the way. And in time, if the process is allowed to unfold, something new begins to take root. This new growth is tentative at first. It is delicate, like the first shoots of green after winter. But it is real. It comes not from the ego's fantasies, but from the depth of the self. In dreams, this process often appears as death, followed by a child being born or a ruined city being rebuilt, or winter landscape giving way to spring. These are not mere symbols. They are the psyche's way of showing that the death has meaning. The old must die for the new to live, not because the old was wrong or evil, but because it had fulfilled its function. It had carried the individual as far as it could. Now a new phase of life begins, one rooted in a deeper understanding of the psyche's unfolding. This understanding does not come easily. It must be lived. It cannot be forced or simulated. It comes through experience, through endurance, through the willingness to face the unknown and remain faithful to the process. It is a slow rebirth, often occurring beneath the surface of awareness. But when it comes, it brings with it a quiet power, a sense of authenticity, a feeling of being aligned with life rather than at odds with it. This is the meaning of psychological death and rebirth, not a single moment, but a passage, a profound reorganization of the self that opens the door to deeper consciousness. In the journey of becoming, letting go is not the final act, but the sacred beginning. What appears to the ego as an end is in truth the threshold through which the deeper self steps forward. The surrender of the known, painful though it may be, is the price of authenticity. Through the symbolic death of what we once clung to, space is made for the quiet emergence of who we truly are. This transformation is not an escape from suffering, but a conscious passage through it, guided not by the ego's need for certainty, but by the soul's deeper call toward wholeness. You are not losing yourself, you are being returned to yourself. Good luck on your journey inward. May you have the strength to let go, the courage to endure the unknown, and the wisdom to recognize yourself when you finally arrive. Thank you for walking this path of truth and depth.